I used to work late at a small bookstore in my town. It was an old building, built in the early 1900s, with creaky wooden floors and dim lighting that made the place feel eerily empty at night. My shift ended at 11 p.m., and since I lived just a few blocks away, I always walked home. The streets were usually quiet, the only sounds being the occasional car passing by or the distant barking of a dog. But one particular night, I felt something different. As I locked up the store and started my walk home, I had this strange sensation of being watched. At first, I shrugged it off as exhaustion. I had been working all day, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. But a few minutes later, I noticed something odd. My shadow wasn't alone. Under the glow of a street lamp, I saw my shadow stretching out in front of me. But there was another shadow beside it, long, thin, and moving in sync with me. My heart started pounding as I turned around. No one was there. The street was completely empty. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. But when I started walking again, the second shadow followed. I quickened my pace, my breath coming out in short gasps. Every time I passed a streetlight, I checked the ground. It was still there. And worse, it seemed to be getting closer. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was practically running. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door and rushed inside. I slammed the door shut, locking every bolt and chain. My apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. I hesitated for a moment before pulling back the curtain, and that's when I saw it. A tall, thin figure stood beneath the streetlight, staring up at my window. It had no face, no distinct features, just a dark silhouette, impossibly still. My stomach twisted as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I stood there, frozen, unable to look away. Then, it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It just glided, smoothly, effortlessly, toward my building. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to move, to do something. But before I could react, the streetlight flickered, and the figure disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light on, staying up until the sun rose. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some kind of hallucination, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. Because for weeks after that night, every time I walked home, I felt it. Watching, waiting. And sometimes, even when I was safe inside, I'd catch a glimpse of something just outside my window. A shadow, standing still, patient, waiting for the night to fall again. A few nights later, I was walking home from work again, still shaken by what I had seen. I told myself I was being paranoid. I forced myself to take deep breaths, to stay calm. But as I walked under a street lamp, I made the mistake of looking down. The second shadow was back. It was closer this time, moving slightly ahead of me instead of behind. I stopped walking. The shadow stopped too. I turned slowly, terrified of what I might see. The street behind me was still empty. But this time, I felt something different. Like the air had changed. Like something unseen was standing just behind me. I couldn't hear anything, but I could feel it. My body screamed at me to run. I bolted the last few blocks to my apartment, taking the stairs 2 at a time. When I reached my door, I fumbled with my keys, barely able to breathe. Then I heard it. A soft, whispering sound. Right behind me. I forced the key into the lock, turned it, and shoved the door open. I slammed it shut behind me and pressed my back against it, my heart pounding. The whispering stopped. I stood there for minutes, maybe longer, before finally gathering the courage to check the peephole. The hallway was empty. I double-checked the locks and left every single light on that night. I barely slept, my mind racing with questions. What did it want? Why was it following me? Would it ever stop? I avoided walking home alone after that. I started taking a cab, even though it was expensive. But one night, about a week later, I had no choice. It was raining, and there were no cabs in sight. I had to walk. The moment I stepped onto the sidewalk, I felt it again. That presence. The weight of something unseen watching me. I didn't look at my shadow. I didn't check the street behind me. I just kept walking, my pulse hammering in my ears. When I finally reached my apartment building, I dared to glance over my shoulder. It was standing at the end of the street, closer than ever. Still faceless, still motionless, just standing there, waiting. I ran inside, slammed the door, and didn't stop running until I was inside my apartment, locking every possible entrance behind me. I was shaking. My breath was uneven. My hands were ice cold. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? There's a shadow following me. They'd think I was crazy. I didn't see it again for months after that night, but the feeling never went away. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night feeling like something is in my room. I see shadows shifting in the corners, hear faint whispers when everything is silent. And once in a while, when I check the street outside my window, I swear I see something waiting. It started with a phone call, a simple, unassuming ring in the middle of the night, the kind that jolts you awake, leaving you dazed and disoriented. I had barely been asleep for an hour when the sharp sound pierced through the heavy silence of my bedroom. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, until I opened my eyes and saw the glowing screen of my phone illuminating the dark room. I groggily reached for it, squinting at the display. Unknown number. I hesitated. Who calls at 3 a.m.? I almost ignored it, assuming it was some spam or wrong number. But something, an uneasy feeling deep in my stomach, urged me to pick up. Slowly, I swiped to answer. Hello? For a few seconds, there was nothing. Just empty, suffocating silence. Then, a faint, unnatural sound crackled through the speaker. Breathing, not normal breathing. It was ragged, uneven, as if whoever was on the other end was struggling for air, gasping through shattered lungs. The sound sent a wave of ice through my veins. I swallowed hard, gripping the phone tighter. Who is this? I whispered. Still, no response. Just more of that horrible, broken breathing. But then, through the static, I heard something else. A voice, distant, warped, and horrifyingly familiar. Emily? My blood turned to ice. That voice, it was impossible, because it belonged to my mother. The only problem was, she had been dead for 3 years. A sharp, suffocating terror gripped my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind refused to believe what I had just heard. But then, the voice spoke again. Emily, can you hear me? My vision blurred with panic. My mother had been killed in a car accident 3 years ago. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. And yet, her voice, weak, desperate, broken, was right there, coming through the phone. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands trembling violently. Mom, I whispered, my voice cracking. Another long pause, then barely audible through the static. Help me. The call cut off. The silence in my apartment was deafening. I sat there in bed, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart was slamming against my ribs, my entire body shaking. I immediately checked the call log. Nothing. No record of an incoming call. It was as if the conversation had never happened. I tried calling back. The number didn't exist. A deep, gnawing dread coiled around my spine. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was just a nightmare bleeding into reality. But deep down, I knew the truth. That was my mother's voice, and something was horribly wrong. I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept replaying the call, analyzing every breath, every syllable of my mother's voice, the desperate way she had begged for help. What did she mean? Help her from what? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe grief was finally playing tricks on me. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I knew. It was real. And that was the worst part. A few nights later, I woke up again. Not to a phone call this time, to the sound of static. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder with each passing second. I sat up, my body cold with fear. It wasn't coming from my phone. It was coming from the TV. I never left my TV on. I hadn't even used it that night. And yet, there it was, glowing in the darkness, filled with black and white static. My pulse skyrocketed as I slowly slid out of bed. The static crackled and hissed, and as I got closer, I felt something wrong. The air was heavy, charged, thick with an unseen presence. Then, just for a fraction of a second, the screen changed. A flash of a road, twisted metal, a bloodied hand reaching out. It was the crash, the moment my mother had died. Then, the TV shut off. I stood there in the pitch-black room, my breath coming in short gasps. Something was trying to show me something. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't safe. That same night, my phone vibrated again. I picked it up with trembling hands. No caller ID. I knew I shouldn't answer. But I did. The voice on the other end wasn't my mother's this time. It was distorted, twisted, a gurgling, inhuman whisper that made my skin crawl. "You should have answered sooner." I screamed. I don't even remember dropping my phone, but the next thing I knew, I was outside my apartment, barefoot, shaking, tears burning down my cheeks. The calls didn't stop. They always came at 3 a.m., always from an unknown number. I stopped answering, but sometimes, even without picking up, I could hear the breathing and the whispering. I thought that maybe if I ignored it long enough, it would stop. It didn't. One night, I was walking home from work when my phone rang again. No caller ID. I refused to answer. But then, the ringing didn't stop. It grew louder and louder until it felt like the sound was coming from inside my head. Panicked, I finally picked up. And what I heard next wasn't static. It was the sound of a car horn, screeching tires, a woman screaming, and then a sickening crash. The exact moment my mother had died. Tears filled my eyes. I knew what this was. A warning. My phone buzzed one last time. One new voicemail. I hesitated, my fingers trembling as I pressed play. "Emily, please, don't let it take you to..." Then static. I haven't answered a phone call at 3 a.m. since. And I never will. Because now, I know the truth. It wasn't my mother on the other end of that call. It was something else. And it's still looking for me. Moving into my new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start. After my breakup, I needed a change. A new place, new energy, a chance to be alone and heal. The place was small, but cozy. A one-bedroom unit on the third floor of an older apartment complex. It had that slightly musty scent that all old buildings carry, but nothing that a few scented candles couldn't fix. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in months, I felt like I was finally putting the pieces of my life back together. The first few days were spent unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting used to the new space. My apartment had a slightly odd layout. A narrow hallway led from the front door to the main living area, with my bedroom and bathroom on the left side. The kitchen, while small, had enough space for what I needed, and a single window overlooked the quiet street below. The building itself was old but well maintained, though my upstairs neighbors seemed to have a habit of dropping things at odd hours of the night. At first, everything seemed normal, but then strange things started happening. It started subtly, things that could easily be explained away. I would come home from work and find my closet door slightly open, even though I was sure I had closed it. My phone charger would be missing from my nightstand, only to be found on the kitchen counter. The TV turned on by itself once while I was in the shower, the volume blaring at full blast. At first, I brushed it off as absent-mindedness. Maybe I was just exhausted, adjusting to a new routine. The stress of the breakup, moving, and starting over could have been making me forget things. But as the days passed, the disturbances grew more frequent. One evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught something odd in the bathroom mirror. The reflection of my bedroom door behind me. It was open. I knew for a fact that I had closed it. Slowly, I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I swallowed hard. "Just the air pressure," I muttered, trying to convince myself. Maybe I didn't close it all the way. I walked over and shut it firmly, making sure it latched. That night, I slept with the lights on. The disturbances escalated quickly. Some nights, I would wake up to the sound of whispers. Not clear words, just faint, muffled voices, like someone was having a conversation in another room. Other nights, I would hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway toward my bedroom. I would lie there, frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening as the footsteps stopped right outside my door. I started keeping my bedroom door locked, but the worst came one night when I saw it. I had been drifting in and out of sleep when I suddenly felt it, a presence in the room. You know that feeling when someone is watching you, that deep, primal instinct that tells you something is very, very wrong. I opened my eyes, and in the far corner of my room, something was standing there, a tall, shadowy figure, motionless, watching. My breath caught in my throat. My body refused to move. It was like a nightmare where you want to run, but your limbs are made of stone. I could barely breathe. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if waiting for something. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart slamming against my ribs. 1 second, 2 seconds. When I opened them again, it was gone. But the feeling of being watched never left. At this point, I was terrified to be in my own apartment. I tried rationalizing everything. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was exhaustion, stress, anything to avoid admitting the truth. But the activity only got worse. One night, as I was washing dishes, I felt something move behind me. A sudden gust of cold air, like someone had walked past me. I turned around, my stomach twisting into knots. Nothing. I checked the windows. All shut. The door, locked. I took a deep breath and turned back to the sink. That's when I heard it. A low, raspy breathing. Right next to my ear. I screamed and spun around. No one was there. The room was empty, but I could still feel it. Something unseen lingering nearby. I barely slept that night. And then, 2 nights later, came the worst part. It spoke. It was past midnight, and I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the unease that had become a constant in my home. Then, just as I was about to drift off, a voice, low, whispery, right next to my ear. "Get out!" My entire body froze. The room was empty. I knew it was. But I had heard it. A deep, menacing whisper right beside me. I shot up, gasping for air. My skin crawled, my heart racing. I fumbled for the light, my hands trembling. The second the lamp flicked on, I felt it. The air in the room thick, suffocating, like something unseen was looming over me. That was it. I was done. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, my phone, and bolted out of that apartment without looking back. I slept in my car that night, too scared to even think about going back inside. The next morning, I called my landlord and told him I was breaking my lease. I didn't care about the penalties. I didn't care if I lost my deposit. I just needed to leave. Strangely, he didn't argue. He simply sighed and said, "I understand." I never asked what he meant by that, and I never went back. To this day, I still don't know what was in that apartment, but I know one thing for sure. I was never alone. And that brings us to the end of these 3 disturbing, true, scary stories. But remember, just because the stories end here doesn't mean the terror stops. The unknown lurks in the quiet corners of our world, hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. Maybe you've seen something move in the darkness when no one was there. Maybe you felt an unnatural chill run down your spine in an empty room. Or maybe you've experienced something so terrifying that you've never spoken about it, afraid that saying it out loud would make it real. The truth is, the world is full of things we cannot explain. Strange encounters, eerie whispers, and unseen forces have haunted people for centuries. Every time we convince ourselves that ghosts and monsters aren't real, something happens that makes us question everything. The stories we shared today may have ended, but out there, somewhere, another nightmare is just beginning. Have you ever had an unsettling experience that still lingers in your thoughts? Have you ever seen something that defied all logic? If you have a terrifying true story, We want to hear it. Send in your own scary stories, and your chilling encounter could be featured in a future video. Who knows? Maybe your story will be the one to keep someone awake at night. If you enjoyed these horrifying tales, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real horror stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload, because the scariest things often happen when you least expect them. Sleep well, if you dare.